though it is incomplete. We get this sense of paradise from verses such as Luke 23:43, where Christ tells the thief on the cross that he would be with him in paradise. Or 2 Corinthians 12:3, where St. Paul describes his mystical vision as being caught up into paradise. Yet we also see paradise used in Revelation 2:7b. To the one who conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. Eating of the tree of life is a reference to Eden. And so we can see that Eden, the mountain of God, heaven, and paradise are really all the same place. Yet the word paradise is itself a kind of redemption, because it does not have a biblical origin, but rather comes out of Persian paganism. It is from the Proto-Iranian, the earliest form of Persian, word paradisia, which came via Persian into Greek as paradisos, and thence into Latin and French, then into English as paradise. It originally meant a walled enclosure, and its earliest uses certainly were within pagan contexts. When Greek borrowed it from Persian, it referred to the massive sacred walled gardens of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which featured 4 waterways coming to a point at the center. When the Old Testament was translated into Greek, paradisos referred to Eden. The New Testament uses that same word and also applies it to the heavenly experience with God in Eden, itself a garden with 4 rivers flowing outward. Thus, by the use of paradise, the scriptures are not simply importing a pagan concept, but using a known image to describe the setting for humankind's experience of God on earth. Humanity's placement in Eden was not merely to give them a kind of permanent vacation in a lush environment, which is what we might imagine when we use paradise to describe, for instance, tropical islands for a warm getaway in the winter. Rather, God gave Adam and Eve work to do when he placed them in paradise. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Genesis 1:27-28. This 2-part command of fertility, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and cultivation, subdue the earth, directly parallels God's own actions in the creation. We saw how God first gave the earth structure, taming the chaos, then how he filled that structure with life, creating plants and animals, and finally, humans. Humankind, therefore, is to do the same structuring, cultivating the earth not only in the sense of agriculture, but more broadly in terms of the structuring that is beautification and civilization. And they are also to fill the earth with life, not only through human fertility and having children, but with all kinds of life, both literally and figuratively. Generally speaking, Adam's emphasis was on cultivation, or structuring, which is why his first act along these lines was to name the animals, Genesis 2:19-20. Eve's emphasis was on fertility, which is why God created her, when he found that no animal would fit, that is, for reproduction, with Adam, Genesis 2:20-24. These are not really separate tasks, however. Adam and Eve needed each other for their primary tasks, and God called both to participate in both tasks. Also, he gave the commands, as it says, to them, not to each or to one alone. We also should not reduce their tasks to building and childbirth. Cultivation has an almost infinite sense of application, for everything from architecture and engineering to agriculture, from philosophy and theology to storytelling. Likewise, fertility is not only about giving birth to children and raising them, but about filling all things with life and beauty. Again, though, God gave these 2 commands to all of humanity, and the scriptures repeat them several times. We should not take these emphases as simply playing to gender stereotypes, because scripture does not sharply distinguish them. Furthermore, these tasks enable humans to participate in the creative, life-giving work of God himself. Not only did God design this for Eden, he commissioned humans to expand Eden outward, to make the whole cosmos into paradise. Eden and its expansion were God's models for human civilization. All is lost, however, when Adam and Eve eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, fruit they were not yet ready for. They disobeyed the commandment God had given them, trying to take what the church fathers say God ultimately would have given them, but they were yet too immature for it. The rise of civilization. When Adam and Eve fall, having transgressed God's commandment, they receive the consequence of death, which is a mercy from God that enables their repentance. And God drives them out of Eden and cuts them off from the tree of life. Genesis 3:19 and 22 through 24. Adam and Eve lost God's design for humankind, which was to experience his presence and live with him in communion in everlasting life. Furthermore, God did not withdraw their two tasks of fertility and cultivation as commands, but what has happened has made them more difficult, with Eve experiencing pain in childbirth and Adam's agricultural work becoming painful and onerous. Genesis 3:16 through 19 refers to these consequences of sin as a curse. As the curse sets into the world, human civilization takes a turn for the worse. The Bible's story of human civilization does not continue with Adam and Eve, however, nor with their son Seth, from whom Noah eventually will descend, but rather with Cain, who killed his brother Abel. In other words, humankind's model of civilization begins with a murderer. Genesis 4 details the beginnings of what humanity would recognize as civilization, the founding of a city, and the development of technology and culture. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When Enoch built a city, he called the name of the city according to the name of his son. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mahujael, and Mahujael fathered Methushael, and Methushael fathered Lamech. Genesis 4:17 through 18. At the beginning of this passage, the first city is built. In most translations, one gets the impression that Cain builds the first city and names it after his son Enoch. But the Hebrew is actually ambiguous here, with only the pronoun he designated as the one who built the city and called it after the name of his son. In historical context, however, it makes more sense to read this as Enoch building the first city and then naming it for his son, whom the following verse identifies as Irad. What is that context? And why does this matter? In Mesopotamian tradition, the first city in the world is named Eridu. The name Irad itself means city of dominion, and it is etymologically cognate with Eridu. This matters because, if we read it this way, Genesis embeds the Cain civilization narrative into ancient pagan traditions, a pattern we have already seen several times. Local Sumerian pagan mythology said that the water god Enki founded Eridu, and he lived there within Abzu, a spring from which water flowed that brought life to the whole earth. You can see the obvious similarity here to Eden, the source of the four rivers that water all life on earth. By using this Eridu reference, therefore, the Bible is depicting the first city built by humanity as a kind of false Eden, a mockery of what God had made. A false Eden represents a significant theme in the scriptures, the attempt by human beings to make for themselves that which God had already given them or was going to give them. This theme is not about humans growing up and striking out on their own, but it is rather about breaking away from communion with God to try to take something on independently, which we saw with the taking of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tale of the beginnings of human civilization continues. And Lamech took two wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. Zillah also bore Tubal-Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Genesis 4:19-22. Here we see the rise of nomadic animal husbandry, music, and metallurgy, the first human technologies. How can these be evil? Why associate them with Cain? Probably the most obviously problematic technology here is metallurgy, the making of instruments of bronze and iron. What kinds of instruments? This, of course, is a reference to weapons. As with many kinds of technology, the first thing that humanity developed with metallurgy was ways to kill each other. It's perhaps harder to see what the problem with animal husbandry might be. This shift from hunting wild game to keeping livestock is one of the developments that enabled the amassing of wealth. When animals are controlled rather than tracked down, the possibility opens up of some people having more than others. But what could possibly be wrong with music? We find a clue in the word music itself, which ultimately derives from the Greek phrase musiki techni, the art of the muses. The ancient world believed that this art was given by divine beings. In the pagan Greek case, the muses, who were the source of all knowledge regarding literature, science, and the arts. The word muse in English has come to be so common now to refer merely to inspiration that we may not realize it was a reference to goddesses. We might get some sense of how this would have sounded to ancient peoples, though, if we refer to electrical engineering, for instance, as the art of Zeus, from the Greek god associated with thunder and lightning. Saint Irenaeus of Lyon makes reference to fallen angels giving knowledge of such things, which were, quote, teachings of wickedness, in that they brought them the virtues of roots and herbs, dyeing in colors and cosmetics, the discovery of rare substances, love potions, aversions, amours, concupiscence, constraints of love, spells of bewitchment, and all sorcery and idolatry hateful to God, by the entry of which things into the world evil extended and spread, while righteousness was diminished and enfeebled. End quote. This reflects a belief in the ancient world that the knowledge of techni came from spirits. Techni means the arts, broadly defined, which included not only what the modern world calls art, but also what we would call medicine, engineering, and so on. Things that humans make. Techni is the origin of our word technology. Music, therefore, is a techni given originally by demons, and its most ancient associations are especially with seduction and sorcery. As with the rise of animal husbandry and metallurgy, it is about control over other humans. The same theme of the demonic origin of technology is represented in the Jewish text 1st Enoch, which gives the names of various demons who grant different kinds of knowledge. And Azazel taught the people the art of making swords and knives, and shields and breastplates. And he showed to their chosen ones bracelets, decorations, shadowing of the eye with antimony, ornamentation, the beautifying of the eyelids, all kinds of precious stones, and all coloring tinctures and alchemy. And there were many wicked ones, and they committed adultery and erred, and all their conduct became corrupt. Amasaris taught incantation and the cutting of roots, and Armaros the resolving of incantations, and Barakial astrology, and Kokararel the knowledge of the signs, and Tamelk taught the seeing of the stars, and Asdarel taught the course of the moon as well as the deception of man. And the people cried, and their voice reached unto heaven. 1st Enoch 8. As you can see, this divine source of technological knowledge does not only apply to music, but to all these advancements. Perhaps the most famous example in the English-speaking world is the gift of fire to humanity from the Titan Prometheus. Thus we see that the rise of technology in Cain's line that Genesis 4 describes is not meant as a technological history, that is, a list of inventors. Rather, Genesis is making use of this ancient association of the rise of technology with fallen divine beings to make a point about the nature of the wickedness of Cain and his offspring. It comes from cooperation with demons. That is why St. Irenaeus says that with the proliferation of technology, the affairs of wickedness were propagated to overflowing. Babel. In the scriptures, the city of Babylon, historically the capital of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which lasted from 626 to 539 BC, is an image of the fallenness of human civilization. Before we get to this city, however, we get the story of a civilization called Babel. Babel is first referenced in Genesis 10:8 through 10, which notes it as the kingdom of a giant hunter called Nimrod, and its story unfolds in the following chapter. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Genesis 11:1 through 9. Babel is connected here via pun with Balal, a Hebrew word meaning confusion. But its origin is the Assyrian Bab-ilu, gate of a god. Why would it be called that? We have good reason to believe that the tower being built in the center of Babel was a ziggurat, a step pyramid structure designed to be an artificial mountain on which people may meet and worship gods. See the previous chapter for more on the relationship between mountains and worship. Thus, the tower with its top in the heavens was not so tall that it literally reached the sky, which is where God is. Sometimes one hears the story interpreted this way, that the tower builders thought they could reach God just by building a very tall tower, as though God is at some particular altitude. Keeping ancient cosmology in mind, however, we know that a tower whose top is in the heavens is designed rather to be a place where you could reach your God through ritual means. That is why the city has a name that means gate of a god, because the ziggurat served as that gate. We will talk more about how worship works in the next chapter, but for our purposes here, we will note that ancient people used ziggurats for idolatry. We mentioned earlier how people used idols to draw gods into them so that the gods might be trapped and controlled. Thus, the tower in Babel was built to draw God himself, or perhaps a lesser god, down so that the people might use the religious technology of idolatry. Through this, they would make a name for themselves, not only preventing their dispersion, but rising up in greatness. It was a scheme to become the literal and figurative height of human civilization, in which nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. As Genesis 11 relates, God does, of course, descend to the tower. But instead of submitting to enter into the idol in the ziggurat and participate in their blasphemous scheme, he scatters the Babel civilization through confusing their languages. In Orthodox tradition, Pentecost in the book of Acts reverses this scattering, where the apostles gained the ability to be heard in any language, and all humankind is invited to reunite by entering the church. So what is Babel? It is the continuation of the story of the civilization of Cain, which becomes more wicked as time goes by, acquiring demonic knowledge and then finally attempting to control God himself. This ultimate blasphemy is what destroys the city. The Babel story follows Genesis 10, which is the genealogical story of the 70 nations that descend from Noah and his sons and fill the earth. Genesis 11 is not simply what happens next, however, but instead it tells the story of the growth and spread of human civilization from another angle. So the stories really are about the same thing, the scattering of the nations and their descent into greatest wickedness. That this is so becomes apparent from clues found elsewhere in the Bible. Deuteronomy 32:8, for example, refers to the Genesis 11 story, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance. When he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. There is an important note on translation here. Sons of God is the reading from the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Masoretic text that many Protestant Bibles use instead reads Sons of Israel, which is an anachronism that makes no sense because Israel did not exist at this point in the narrative. The Greek Old Testament texts render this angelon theou, angels of God. In other words, when God divided up the nations at the Babel event, he assigned them angelic beings called sons of God to govern them. Why would he do that? Because after the flood, he promised he would never destroy the earth this way again. Genesis 9:8-17. The flood was an effect of being in God's presence while greatly wicked, death by holiness. Because wickedness was again multiplying, God withdrew his direct presence to spare humankind, but he assigned them angels to serve as their patrons and protectors, one for each of the nations. Traditional Orthodox icons of the Tower of Babel depict this assignment. In the center you see the tower, reaching up to the heavens. In front of the tower are 3 angels, representing the authority of God, sending the nations away in every direction, giving to each one a scroll from a basket in front of them. The scrolls represent the languages of the nations. On the left and right, you see men walking away from the tower, each dressed in the national garb of one nation or another, carrying their scrolls. Each man has an angel directly above and behind him, accompanying him on his way. The story does not end there, as Deuteronomy 32:16-17 relates. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. These new gods, the demons the people worshipped, were in fact the angelic patrons that God had assigned to the nations. They became fallen angels, and they cemented their relationship with their nations through the practice of idolatry. The descent of human civilization into wickedness was now total, with the people worshiping spirits other than the Most High God. This story is the biblical account of the rise of paganism, with which human civilization is completely bound up. Babylon. How does Babel relate to Babylon? Most English Bibles don't make apparent that the Hebrew transliterated in Genesis 10 and 11 as Babel is also rendered Babylon in other places. So the scriptures use the same name for both the city with a tower in the center and also the city we will see again later, where people like the prophet Daniel lived. Babylon is of course a literal civilization that, among other things, deports the people of Israel from their land, and where a number of the prophetic narratives of the Old Testament occur. It is also, however, a biblical symbol bound up with idolatry and wickedness. God will therefore destroy this Babylon. We see this in the revelation to St. John, where an angel says in the vision, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality." Revelation 14:8. We also read, "The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and God remembered Babylon the Great, to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath." Revelation 16:19. The city is Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. Revelation 17:5. The Babylon imagery of Revelation is aimed toward its destruction. Yet notice that Babylon is not merely one city or even one empire, but rather that which intoxicates the nations with sexual immorality, which throughout the scriptures is often associated with idolatry. Babylon is the ultimate symbol of human civilization, suffused with idolatry, self-serving people, and all kinds of wickedness. If sin were embodied as a city, that city is Babylon. Yet while Babylon made the world drink its cup of immorality, the cup of wrath that God gave Babylon to drink was his justice, which he brought against the city in order to end its evil. God's destruction of Babylon comes to its fullness in Revelation 18, where an angel again cries out, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living." Revelation 18:2-3. The kings of the earth cry out, "Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come." Revelation 18:10. While merchants and shipmasters weep for all the loss of luxury and wealth. 18:11-20. Finally, an angel throws a great millstone into the sea and says that Babylon will likewise be destroyed, bringing an end to its culture. So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence, and will be found no more. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters, will be heard in you no more. And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. And the light of a lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints, and of all who had been slain on earth. Revelation 18:21-24. Note what Revelation describes here: wealth, music, and technology, accompanied by sorcery and murder. We are reading here of the end of the city of Cain, just as it was described in Genesis 4 and understood by its ancient readers. The city of God. The Bible's use of the same name for what happened with the tower at Babel and for the empire called Babylon is an anachronism. It is impossible to know exactly when the events depicted at the tower took place, but the empire known by this name flourished in the 6th and 7th centuries BC. The two are divided very likely by at least centuries, if not millennia. If you connect all this with Eridu, which seems to have been founded around 5400 BC, it's clear that the scriptures bring together multiple stories spanning a broad sweep of time. For our purposes, the dates don't really matter very much. The point is that the Babylon phenomenon is a narrative strand that begins with Cain and finds its fullness with the image of imperial Babylon. As we've seen, this whole complex of imagery goes into what we find in Revelation. Notably, Revelation 18 also includes these words from the angel: Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues, for her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Revelation 18, 4-5. Here is the call of God to those who would become his people. Come out of Babylon, because judgment is coming upon it. God does not merely call us out of Babylon, however. He provides a way out. And the narrative begins with Abraham, who lives in a place called Ur of the Chaldeans. Ur is a word that means simply city, while the Chaldeans are, of course, the Babylonians, whose empire doesn't yet exist at the time of Abraham. Again, we are looking at the Bible anachronistically pulling in another story and setting it in Babylon. Abraham's story, which you can read starting at the end of Genesis 11, immediately follows the Babel story. So the impression one gets is that God calls him out from Babel. The Ur that he left may be identified with a Sumerian city called Uruk, and it notably is the site of a great ziggurat, which you can visit in the modern country of Iraq. The Bible therefore presents a continuum of various names that all encompass one image, whether you want to call it Eridu, Babel, Ur, Uruk, or Babylon. This city is the creation of humans, filled with demonic evil and dominated by fallen angels who teach humans evil. God tasks Abraham, therefore, to leave Babylon and begin a new nation, which will become Israel, called out by God not only from Ur, but eventually also from Egypt, which was functioning as Babylon for the Israelites in that period, a city of evil, ruled by demons. St. Augustine compares the wickedness of Babylon with the righteousness of the city of God. Quote, "And certainly this is the great difference which distinguishes the two cities of which we speak, the one being the society of the godly men, the other of the ungodly, each associated with the angels that adhere to their party, and the one guided and fashioned by love of self, the other by love of God." End quote. Here he refers not only to the radical difference in quality between God's godly civilization and humankind's ungodly one, but he also says that each are associated with the angels that adhere to their party. That is, God's city is associated with obedient angels who lead humans towards salvation, while humankind's city is accompanied by demons, fallen angels who lead people away from God. God's creation of Israel, and then the final culmination of it as the New Jerusalem, is the city St. Augustine is writing about. We see a glimpse of it in Revelation. "The one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name." Revelation 3:12. "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away." Revelation 21, 1-4. What characterizes the New Jerusalem, the city of God? Paradise, the restoration and fullness of Eden, the place where God dwells with humans, and where humanity is joined to him with joy in worship forever. Chapter 6. The Worship of God. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God, and ate and drank. Exodus 24, 9-11. The work of the priesthood is done on earth, but it is ranked among heavenly ordinances. And this is only right, for no man, no angel, no archangel, no other created power, but the Paraclete himself, ordained this succession, and persuaded men while still remaining in the flesh to represent the ministry of angels. The priest therefore must be as pure as if he were standing in heaven itself in the midst of those powers. St. John Chrysostom. When the worship of God first appears in the Bible in Genesis 4, the text doesn't define what it is, nor do we get much detail about how people carried out that worship. There isn't even a recorded commandment from God that Cain and Abel were following. Fully detailed commands from God for how to worship him don't appear until Leviticus, the third book of the Scriptures. Nonetheless, people worshipped God over and over prior to those detailed commands, and the worship is carried out not just by Adam and Eve's first sons, but also by Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and others. Likewise, we see pagans worshiping their gods. It's clear from the hints the Bible gives about worship in the pre-Leviticus texts that the worshipers know what they're doing. It's also clear that what they are doing, both the incipient Israel and the surrounding nations, is remarkably consistent even in comparison with each other. Worship was not an undefined action, and the original readers and hearers of Leviticus had worship experience before receiving those instructions. It doesn't come out of the blue with the giving of the Torah on Sinai. So what exactly is worship in the historical Christian context? In contrast to the ancient world, in our modern period, that question is not very easy to answer. Based on all the things that go by the name worship in English, it seems to mean doing religious things, especially religious things directed toward God. So it might be singing songs or bowing, or it might be offering the Eucharist on an altar. Worship also gets used to refer to sermons or even socializing. Yet what did it mean for the ancient world in which Christianity arose? They seem to know what it meant and how to do it. Before we can see both the forest and the trees of this question, we need to clear out some linguistic underbrush for us English speakers. In English, worship derives from worth, and for most of the history of worship in English, to worship someone or something is to ascribe worthiness, making it roughly a synonym of words like praise or venerate. Modern English retains this use of worship in only a few contexts. You might be familiar with the indirect address of British judges as "Your Worship," or the Anglican wedding service, where the bride and groom say to each other, "With my body I thee worship." Translations of some religious texts also use worship this way, such as the January 16th feast in the Orthodox Church, usually called the veneration of the precious chains of the Apostle Peter, but sometimes translated as the worship of the precious chains of the Apostle Peter. The festal texts even include hymns like this, quote, "Without leaving Rome, thou didst come to us by the precious chains which thou didst wear, O foremost of the apostles, and worshipping them with faith, we pray, by thine intercessions with God, grant us great mercy." End quote. To those conditioned with the idea that worship is due to God alone, this language might seem shockingly idolatrous. Yet no one who calls a judge "your worship," or gets married using the Book of Common Prayer, considers judges or newlyweds to be gods. Nor do Orthodox Christians who venerate the chains of St. Peter regard those chains as gods. Given these examples, and also the historical usage of worship in English, it's important to set aside the shock and ask this critical question: what are the actions this word is describing? If we ask that question, and then look at those actions within the context of the ancient world in which human worship arose, then we can understand what Christian worship has historically meant and what it was understood to accomplish. The house of God. The earliest known human settlements, in places such as Göbekli Tepe or Çatalhöyük, both in modern Turkey, or Jericho in the West Bank, all bear the marks of having been situated for cultic purposes. That is, they are worship centers. Still more, however, they show little or no indication of being located near natural resources or for strategic purposes. They are remote, illogical choices for human settlements. Yet, in some cases, massive buildings were constructed, no doubt at great expense of materials and labor. So why build worship centers in these places? To understand what was going on here, let's look at Genesis 28, in which we see a visionary experience of Jacob, the grandson of Abraham. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder, or staircase, set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. Genesis 28, 10 through 13. In this dream vision, Jacob sees a staircase set on the earth and leading to heaven, often referred to as Jacob's ladder. The Hebrew word here is sulam, which the scriptures use only in this one place, and it can be translated as either ladder or staircase because it refers not to a particular kind of object, but rather to something on which one may walk up or down. Thus, Jacob sees God's angels going up and down on it. At the top, he sees God himself, who identifies himself as the same God Abraham and Isaac knew. What is Jacob's ladder exactly? Jacob tells us, how awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Genesis 28:17. Gate of heaven should ring a bell for us, given what we saw in the previous chapter with the Tower of Babel, whose Assyrian origin name Bab-Ilu means gate of a god. While we might usually envision a ladder appearing in Genesis 28, it seems likely that what Jacob saw was, in fact, a ziggurat. Even if you don't accept the ziggurat identification, the biblical imagery does convey the idea that Jacob saw God in this place and identified it as a gate to the heavenly reality where one can access God and his angels. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it, he says. Genesis 28:16. Here Jacob saw and met God. What he does next is critical. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. Genesis 28:18 through 22. Jacob's response to his vision and his realization that the Lord is in this place is to set up a pillar and to consecrate it as belonging to the Lord by anointing it with oil. He also gives the place the name Bethel, which means house of God. Further, he makes vows to God, especially that this particular place will be given to God and regarded as his house. It becomes a place of worship because of the visionary experience that Jacob had there, which revealed to him that God could be accessed there. In pagan contexts, an encounter with a god was possible when the god was discovered to live in a particular place. While the Bible does not teach that God or the worship of God are confined by or limited to certain geographic places, nonetheless, the scriptures do not negatively depict Jacob's setting aside of Bethel as a particular place for God. The scriptures use the name afterward and even anachronistically many times before. If that is not enough, however, God himself confirms this act by saying to Jacob later, "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." Genesis 35:1. This spiritual experience thus explains why ancient cultic centers sprung up in illogical places. Someone had a vision in a place, and so people going on a pilgrimage began to return to the place and participate in that experience. In Jacob's case, he not only had the vision and designated the place as holy to God, but Genesis 35:7 puts his obedience to God's command into these very terms. There he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, which means the God of Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. According to the Bible, and also other sources, worship in the ancient world flowed out of experiences of the divine. It was not something ancient people invented within a mythos devised to explain natural phenomena. Places got set aside for worship because people said they met gods in those places. What is worship for? With some understanding of why particular places get used for worship, we therefore ask, why is worship the response to such an experience? What do the worshipers hope to accomplish? If we set aside for a moment the religious category we have come to call worship, which tends to be bound up with a lot of technical considerations, and look at ancient people's actions when they worship their gods, we can get a sense of what they hoped to accomplish. Consider the beginning of the worship relationship. A person encounters a divine being. What would that ancient person have thought when he or she met that spirit? If he or she met a demon, it may not have been a pleasant experience. The demon could have made it pleasant, though, as we know that even Satan can appear as an angel of light, 2 Corinthians 11:14. Either way, the human knows that he or she is encountering something powerful. If you become aware that a powerful spiritual being lives near you, you could view that spirit as either a threat or an opportunity, or possibly both. What do you do when you hope to stave off a threat or make an ally? Even now, but most especially in the ancient world, you offer hospitality. Pagans offered hospitality to the demons they worshipped because they knew they were powerful and dangerous. Israel offered hospitality to God and was offered hospitality by God because of the relationship of mutual love. Worship as hospitality explains the whole complex of cultic behaviors we see in the ancient world. Sacrifices, incense, poetry, hymns of praise, etc. The piece of this that might not make that much sense to us is sacrifice. How is that hospitality? We tend to think of sacrifice as being about giving something up or about killing. However, in the Levitical sacrifices that God commanded, and even from what we know of pagan sacrifices, the killing of animals was not ritualized, meaning that it was not considered critical to the sacrificial rite. Further, many sacrifices did not even involve animals. They also included drink, oil, grain, and cakes. In cultures farther afield, one can find sacrifices of fresh fruit as well, What do these things all have in common? They are all food. Incense is a sacrifice as well, though it is not consumed. Rather, it renders foul air sweet, or simply makes the air more pleasing, which is part of the larger sense of sacrifice as hospitality. We can see this kind of language in the scriptures for incense, such as in Leviticus 2:2, and also for whole burnt sacrifices, which is food that is wholly offered to God by means of burning, such as in Exodus 29 and Leviticus 1. The language emphasizes all this as a pleasing aroma to God. Some sacrifices were not whole burnt sacrifices. Some portions would be set aside for the priests and the people making the offering for eating, while some portions would be burnt. In this way, it was understood that worshippers were sharing a meal with their God. Across nearly every human culture throughout history, eating a meal together is the core, critical act of hospitality. The full matrix of religious rituals ancient people practiced did not always include sacrifices of food or incense, but sacrifice was always the core of their relationship with their deities. Without the hospitality of sacrifice, there was no real relationship. How does worship work? One of the most startling things one notices about worship in the ancient world is how much most ancient religions have in common with one another, even when comparing pagan worship with Israel's worship. If we remember, however, that everyone sought to share hospitality with their God, then this makes sense. From ancient sources, including the Bible, we can see a typical outline of how sacrifice worked, particularly in the ancient Near East. The first step is the dedication of the elements to be sacrificed. In the context of Israel, a priest or elder might lay his hands upon an animal and say a prayer of offering. Leviticus 4:15, 8:14 through 22. This dedication might be referred to as sanctification, which simply means the setting apart of something for a purpose. Making something holy has the same meaning. The next step is a procession with the sacrificial food to where it will be offered to the god, accompanied by hymns and prayers. If animals are to be sacrificed, they are typically slaughtered nearby. Notably, the slaughter is simply done in an efficient manner and is not ritualized, indicating that the killing itself is not what is important to the sacrifice. Animals were not made to suffer, and in some cases, a ritual offering of a tuft of their hair was placed into the censer, which was to indicate that the animal was considered to be going voluntarily. If an animal is being offered, its blood is drained or collected. Many pagan rituals included drinking blood or pouring out blood as an offering to the god, because it was understood, as it was in Israel, that the life is in the blood. Leviticus 17:11 through 14. Meaning that blood could be used to transfer power to the one who consumed it, a ritual predation. Pagans would also offer blood to dead heroes and spirits. For example, in the Odyssey by Homer, Odysseus does this in hope that the ghost of the blind prophet Tiresias would answer his questions. Quote, "When I had prayed sufficiently to the dead, I cut the throats of the two sheep and let the blood run into the trench, whereon the ghosts came trooping up from Erebus. Brides, young bachelors, old men worn out with toil, maids who had been crossed in love, and brave men who had been killed in battle with their armor still smirched with blood. They came from every quarter and flitted round the trench with a strange kind of screaming sound that made me turn pale with fear. When I saw them coming, I told the men to be quick and flay the carcasses of the two dead sheep and make burnt offerings of them, and at the same time to repeat prayers to Hades and to Proserpine. But I sat where I was, with my sword drawn, and would not let the poor feckless ghosts come near the blood till Tiresias should have answered my questions." End quote. By contrast, God forbade his people to consume the blood. Leviticus 17:10 through 14. Though sacrificial blood was used for sprinkling in purification and atonement rituals. Leviticus 4, 5 through 18, and 16, 11 through 19. The next step is to bring the sacrificial food to a table called the prothesis. There, portions are divided up. Depending on the ritual, some would be for the god, some for the priests, and some for the people making the sacrifice. If animals were being offered, they would be butchered at this point. In the pagan context, the portion set aside for the gods was often the worst part, with the choicest reserved for the priests, while God commanded Israel to give to him the best parts. The priest then took to the altar the portion offered to the god, where he touched it and elevated it, lifting it up to the deity with many prayers. Then he burned it, the sweet smell rising up to the god. For pagans, the deity was present bodily in an idol, but Israel used no idols when worshiping Yahweh. Following the offering to the god, if there were portions reserved for the priests and for those who offered the sacrifice, they would then be taken to a ritual dining area and consumed along with many trapezomata, which means table things, which were side dishes for the feast. In the pagan context, drunkenness and sexual immorality were part of the feasts, but these were of course strictly forbidden to Israel. This basic ritual order, dedication, procession, division of portions, lifting up to the deity, then ritual eating by priests and worshippers separately, is found in the Orthodox Christian divine liturgy to this very day. Does that mean that Orthodox worship is derived from paganism? Of course it doesn't mean that, any more than the worship of ancient Israel was derived from paganism. Both were commanded by God. So how are they different from paganism? The difference appears in the question of communion. What does worship do? The eating of the sacrifices, and for pagans, the immorality as well, put worshippers into communion with their God. What does it mean to be in communion with a God? Sacrifices are hospitality, as I mentioned earlier, and coming together to eat and drink binds together those who share the table. They become one community. The guest receiving the hospitality becomes part of the household. Ancient people considered hospitality so sacred that violating it one way or the other, whether by host or guest, could bring a death penalty or some other curse upon the violator. This sacredness of hospitality is why, for instance, in Acts 14, the people of Lystra in central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, attempt to sacrifice to Saints Paul and Barnabas. After these apostles perform miracles of healing, the locals think them to be the Greek gods Hermes and Zeus, which, of course, the two apostles deny vehemently. Why were the people of Lystra so eager to show them this divine hospitality? We can find the backstory in Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is set in Tyana, in the same region as Lystra. In the story, Zeus and Hermes make a visit disguised as peasants, and everyone refuses them hospitality, but a poor couple named Baucis and Philemon. In revenge for the inhospitality, the two gods destroy the town with a flood, but save the couple and transform their home into a temple. At death, the couple are transformed into intertwining trees that would live forever. Thus, the Lystrans did not want to suffer a similar fate as their forebears. The mythical tale also expresses what happens when people come into communion with a god. In such communion, the god shares his life with the community, and the people become like the god. Baucis and Philemon do not become divine, but their life is transformed, even lasting into death. Most sacrificial communion in the ancient world was far more prosaically designed, however. In the Greek pagan context, if you wanted to win in battle, you would worship Ares, the god of war. If you wanted to be successful in seduction, you might sacrifice to Aphrodite. If you sought wisdom, then you would worship Athena. If looking for agricultural success, you worshipped Demeter. Sacrifice was thus a kind of religious technology, and pagans understood this communion they performed through idolatry as manipulative. The God you served was almost forced to share itself with you. The reality behind worshiping pagan gods is, of course, that the gods cannot actually deliver on their promises of strength and power. The scriptures mention their weakness in numerous places, with perhaps one of the most famous demonstrations being how Saint Elias proved that Baal, the thunder god, could not control the lightning. 1 Kings 18. Even though the pagan gods are weak and powerless compared to Yahweh, worshiping them through sacrifices still puts the worshiper into communion with them. St. Paul identifies this as communion with demons, 1 Corinthians 10, 20 through 21. This communion transforms the worshiper to become like the demons they worship. If one looks at the behavior of the gods of the pagans, who are violent, promiscuous, rapacious, avaricious, gluttonous, and so forth, according to the pagans' own accounts of their gods, then one can understand the vicious cruelty and inhumanity of the ancient pagan world. Understanding all this, then, we can see how sacrificing to Yahweh, the God of Israel, which puts worshippers into communion with Him, is supremely beneficial. If you become like what you worship, then bringing God into your community and being brought into His makes you like Him. What is God like? He is not only unlike the pagan gods in terms of their immorality, but He is also supremely powerful and capable. Communion with God is why the saints are righteous and can perform mighty works in the name of Christ. Fundamentally, then, in terms of its basic actions, worship is not different between pagans and God's people. What made it different was who was at the table of hospitality with them. Pagans invited the likes of Zeus, Thor, and so on to their tables, and their societies became like these gods. Israel invited the loving Creator of all to the table, and thus they became like Him. The Eucharist. When Christ offered the Eucharist to His disciples in the Gospels, He commanded them to do this as my remembrance. Luke 22, 14 through 20, and 1 Corinthians 11, 24 through 25. It may not be obvious to us that He is giving the Eucharist as a sacrifice, according to the pattern we just discussed above, but a look at the Old Testament shows that a remembrance, or memorial before God, was about offering sacrifice. Leviticus 2, 2 through 16, 5:12, 6:15, 24:7, etc. Thus, this was Jesus telling His disciples how to worship Him. And just like it had always been, the core ritual act is the shared meal offered to God. Jesus' command here is to offer up bread and wine, which He says are to be His body and blood. Matthew 26, 26 through 28, Mark 14, 22 through 25, and Luke 22, 14 through 20. Eating what has been offered to God is life-giving. As Jesus Himself said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink His blood, you have no life in you. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever feeds on me, he also will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like the bread the fathers ate and died. Whoever feeds on this bread will live forever." John 6, 53 through 58. Communion with God, who created us and loves us, thus gives immortality, resurrection to life everlasting. Without that communion, you have no life in you. When Christ gave the Eucharist, He made many important distinctions, which the Orthodox Church practices even today, that set it apart from the sacrifices of ancient Israel and of paganism. The most important of them largely resolve into where, in a sense, Christ appears in the sacrifice. Christ is the one, quote, that offereth and is offered, that accepteth and is distributed, end quote, from the prayer of the cherubic hymn in the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. One continuity is that the deity is still the one who accepts the sacrifice, with Christ as he that accepteth. Yet a major discontinuity is in the offerer. No longer does a human priest make the offering, but Christ himself is he that offereth. The bishop or presbyter at the altar participates in Christ's priesthood and is thus considered a priest, but he is not of himself considered a priest. Another discontinuity is in what is being offered. Rather than animals or cakes, Christ himself is the one who is offered. He provides himself for us, offering us his own hospitality, giving even himself to be the one distributed, the greatest possible offering that could be made. Instead of humans feeding their gods in exchange for favors, the God-man himself feeds us and needs nothing from us, giving himself out of love. For these reasons, the core action of worship in the Orthodox Church, the sacrificial meal of Christ's own body and blood, is called the Eucharist, from the Greek Eucharistia, meaning thanksgiving. We offer thanksgiving to God in response to this profound, mystical, life-giving hospitality he offers to us. We have become the guests. He has made us part of his own household. God has flipped the plot, so to speak, and shown what all those sacrifices of the ancient world always pointed to, that God has invited us to his own table and is giving us nothing less than himself. Chapter 7. War against the Gods. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. Exodus 12:12. The saint said, My parents call me Alban, and I shall ever adore and worship the true and living God who created all things. The judge answered very angrily, If you wish to enjoy the happiness of everlasting life, you must sacrifice at once to the mighty gods. Alban answered, The sacrifices which you offer to devils cannot help their votaries, nor fulfill the desires and petitions of their suppliants. On the contrary, he who has offered sacrifices to these images will receive eternal punishment in hell as his reward. St. Bede the Venerable. Perhaps one of the most unappreciated aspects of the Scripture and of the rest of the Orthodox tradition is how much of it was formulated precisely as a response to paganism. In the pages of Scripture, we find not only apologetics against paganism, but also corrections of pagan accounts of the world, appropriations of pagan imagery and language, and even satirical hurling of insults. I've already discussed a number of specific responses to paganism in the preceding chapters. In this one, we will consider a more theoretical approach to paganism according to what we see in Scripture, and also look at some of the particular gods who formed part of the spiritual neighborhood of Israel, and whom sinful leaders often invited into Israel. Israel generally addressed paganism with three possible responses: syncretism, direct opposition, or co-opting elements of paganism for Yahweh. I will incorporate discussion of these three as this chapter proceeds. Myth and mythology. I've used the words myth, mythic, and mythology many times in this book, but now it's time to define them a little more precisely as we consider a more theoretical approach to paganism. In its basic sense, myth, from Greek mythos, means story. I've used mythic a number of times in this book to refer to this sense of story. But of course, I am talking about the kinds of stories that are usually called myths. Stories involving interaction between the seen and unseen world. In popular usage, we tend to use myth to mean a story that is not true. But that is not its original sense, and certainly the ancient people for whom myths were part of their religion did not think of them that way. Myth also does not get used that way in a technical sense in the study of history and religion. The academic discipline of ritual theory makes a useful distinction between myth and mythology. A myth is a story people participate in through rituals that not only make the story part of their lives and shape their imaginations, but they are also the means through which participants enter into the story themselves. The ancient Greek myth of Persephone's abduction by Hades, for instance, was not only a story that Greek pagans told, but one in which they participated by engaging in a ritual search for the abducted goddess, seeking her out and not finding her, joining themselves to the search by her goddess mother Demeter in the process. Christians also, of course, participate in the myths of Christianity through many kinds of rituals, most memorably in Holy Week, when we participate in the stories of the life of Christ, and at Pascha, participating in both Christ's resurrection and the Passover and Exodus from Egypt. Myth, then, contrasts with mythology, which are the stories left over when the ritual participation has fallen into disuse. There is a connection here with the popular use of myth as an untrue story, but it may not be obvious at first. We tend to think that people stop participating in religious rituals because they don't believe in the related stories anymore. But in my pastoral ministry and experience, I've observed that the opposite is usually true. More often, belief falls away after participation falls away, showing that conviction flows from conditioning. It is the ritual participation in the story that plants it firmly within the human person. Why do most people regard the ancient pagan myths as fanciful, untrue stories? Not because they have made a careful investigation into the stories as truth claims, but rather because they no longer have the experience of being joined to the story through ritual. I will not go into it here, but given this reality, it is interesting at least to raise the question of what happens to Christians when Christianity is de-ritualized. When people stop ritually participating in the stories of Christianity, does the Christian myth turn into mere mythology for them? Or what if the rituals change, and the participation is in another kind of story? Pro-demon propaganda. Given what I just said, it's worth noting that nowhere in the Old Testament do we see a command from God about not believing in pagan stories. Why? Because no one thought of religion that way at the time. Belief was not focused on what one agreed was true, or still less on how one felt about religious matters. Rather, God's commands about the pagan religious traditions surrounding Israel are of this type. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Exodus 20:3-6. The command is very clear. Do not make idols of gods, bowing before them and serving them. To serve a god is to engage in the worship I described in the previous chapter. But it is not only to offer up sacrifices, but to enter into the whole matrix of rituals involved in the myths of pagan gods. Why? Because God is a jealous God, meaning that he has set aside Israel for himself and will not share them. The command not to participate in the rituals of the pagan gods gets repeated numerous times throughout the scriptures. More than anything else, Worshipping only Yahweh, the God of Israel, and no other, was what made his people different from the people of all the other nations. So, apart from the actual worship of the gods of the nations, how are pagan stories to be understood? Obviously, God's faithful people in the scriptures did not actually believe stories such as how Zeus overthrew his father Kronos and set himself up as the Most High God, nor did they teach that it was true that Baal did something similar by defeating Yam and Nahar and setting up his own father El as Most High God, with himself as the leader of the divine council. Both of these stories are based on something that the Bible says is true. There was a prominent divine being who attempted to overthrow the Most High God. The scriptures, however, identify that rebellious spirit as the devil, not as the object of worship. Moreover, instead of being victorious, the rebel is defeated and thrown down from the divine council. Isaiah 14:12 through 21, and Ezekiel 28:11 through 19. Since we know from God's revelation what the true story is, we can see that the pagan accounts are essentially pro-demon propaganda. Like most propaganda, they are based on something true, but they are given a spin that is to the demon's advantage, for the purpose of getting humans to worship them and join them in their destruction. The way demons treat humans is not so much for their own benefit. How can one benefit a demon? Rather, it is for the detriment of humans. Having lost the war against God, being incapable of actually taking his place, demons seek revenge by drawing humanity into evil, and therefore destruction and damnation. You can see the way the people of God responded to these stories, both before and after the coming of Christ, was not simply to deny that they were true, but rather to identify what in them was useful, and in many cases offer correction. Since Israel and the church did not participate in the rituals related to these stories, they had moved from myth to mythology for them, bereft of the sting of demonic communion. Reading a story isn't what puts you into communion with demons and makes you like them, but rather engaging in ritual worship of them, and also in doing the work of demons, sin. Psalm 115, 4 through 8, and John 8, 44. St. Basil's Bees. Many people in our own day look at these stories from paganism and balk at the idea that Christians might read them. Some extend this hesitation forward to any stories that include tales of spirits, heroes, gods, and monsters. This might include modern fantasy novels. As we've seen, though, the Bible itself includes stories like these, and as I will show further on, the biblical text sometimes takes elements from pagan stories and reclaims them for God. But even if we do not worship the pagan gods, aren't paganism's stories hopelessly corrupt? Aren't they dangerous for Christians to read? To answer that question, let's turn to one of the greatest theologians of the early church, a man who lived at a time when paganism was still present and part of the dominant culture, even though it was on the wane. St. Basil the Great. St. Basil, who lived from AD 330 to 379, was the bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia in what is modern-day Turkey, and there were plenty of pagans still around at the time. As part of his teaching office as a bishop, he wrote a text commonly titled, An Address to Young Men on the Right Use of Greek Literature. The young men were students. Most students at the time were male, and the Greek literature was, of course, the pagan mythology found in works such as those written by Homer and Hesiod. Here, St. Basil sets out his basic theory for reading these texts. Quote, To begin with the poets, since their writings are of all degrees of excellence, you should not study all of their poems without omitting a single word. When they recount the words and deeds of good men, you should both love and imitate them, earnestly emulating such conduct. But when they portray base conduct, You must flee from them and stop up your ears, as Odysseus is said to have fled past the song of the sirens, for familiarity with evil writings paves the way for evil deeds. Therefore the soul must be guarded with great care, lest through our love for letters it receive some contamination unawares, as men drink in poison with honey." End quote. St. Basil does not say, never read this stuff. Rather, he says to read it critically. If you find something good, praise it and imitate it. If you find something bad, neither praise it nor imitate it. Fascinatingly, in the course of this exhortation, he actually does what he says to do, using a scene from Homer's Odyssey as an illustration. We saw earlier how Odysseus poured out blood for dead spirits, not something any Christian should imitate, but here he avoids the song of the sirens, just as Christians ought to avoid giving their rapt attention to evil in tales. The saint goes on to address the evil of the pagan gods, which readers will find in their stories. Quote, "We shall not praise the poets when they scoff and rail, when they represent fornicators and wine-bibbers, when they define blissfulness by groaning tables and wanton songs. Least of all shall we listen to them when they tell us of their gods, and especially when they represent them as being many, and not at one among themselves. For among these gods at one time brother is at variance with brother, or the father with his children. At another the children engage in truceless war against their parents. The adulteries of the gods, and their amours, especially those of the one whom they call Zeus, chief of all and most high, things of which one cannot speak, even in connection with brutes, without blushing, we shall leave to the stage." End quote. What does he mean by saying that we should not listen to them? Taken out of context, one might interpret this to mean that Christians should not read or listen to these stories at all. But that would go against everything else he says in the text. It would also make him a hypocrite, because he obviously has enough knowledge of pagan literature to make numerous allusions to it in the address. What this means is rather that we should not pay heed to the glory that the pagan authors give to the gods and other sinners in their stories. And again, we should not imitate their behavior. We should leave it to the stage, that is, to the theaters, where one might encounter the stories. St. Basil's overall theory for reading pagan literature finds its summary in this famous passage. Quote, "Now then, altogether after the manner of bees must we use these writings. For the bees do not visit all the flowers without discrimination, nor indeed do they seek to carry away entire those upon which they light, but rather, having taken so much as is adapted to their needs, they let the rest go. So we, if wise, shall take from heathen books whatever befits us and is allied to the truth, and shall pass over the rest. And just as in culling roses we avoid the thorns, from such writings as these we will gather everything useful and guard against the noxious. So from the very beginning we must examine each of their teachings, to harmonize it with our ultimate purpose, according to the Doric proverb, testing each stone by the measuring line." End quote. From this, as the previous passage, we can see that St. Basil's advice about this literature takes three basic forms. Read only what is high quality, take away and imitate the good, avoid and do not imitate the bad. Here he even quotes a Doric proverb, which likely arises in a pagan context, again putting into practice the very advice he gives. What St. Basil says applies even outside the question of reading pagan literature or other texts that have such elements in them. We can treat whatever we encounter in life with the virtues of the bee, taking what is good and leaving behind the bad. One does not even have to engage in constant apologetics against the bad. One can simply leave it alone. The universal applicability of St. Basil's method of interpretation is why he makes what might seem like a shocking statement. Quote, "Into the life eternal the Holy Scriptures lead us, which teach us through divine words. But so long as our immaturity forbids our understanding their deep thought, We exercise our spiritual perception upon profane writings, which are not altogether different, and in which we perceive the truth as it were in shadows and in mirrors. Thus we imitate those who perform the exercises of military practice, for they acquire skill in gymnastics and in dancing, and then in battle reap the reward of their training. We must needs believe that the greatest of all battles lies before us, in preparation for which we must do and suffer all things to gain power. Consequently, we must be conversant with poets, with historians, with orators, indeed with all men who may further our soul's salvation. Just as dyers prepare the cloth before they apply the dye, be it purple or any other color, so indeed must we also, if we would preserve indelible the idea of the true virtue, become first initiated in the pagan lore, then at length give special heed to the sacred and divine teachings, even as we first accustom ourselves to the sun's reflection in the water, and then become able to turn our eyes upon the very sun itself." End quote. He actually says here that we must, quote, "become first initiated in the pagan lore, then at length give special heed to the sacred and divine teachings," end quote. Learn the pagan texts before turning to the Bible. Why? Because we acquire the basic skills we need for reading and interpretation with this lesser literature before we can understand the deeper things of the Bible, the shadows and reflection we apprehend before we can gaze upon the sun. Thus, far from telling Christians to avoid anything that does not have a Christian label on it, St. Basil says that, quote, "we must be conversant with poets, with historians, with orators, indeed with all men who may further our soul's salvation," end quote. That includes even pagans. Before we turn to some specifics related to paganism in the Bible, I will say one last thing here in terms of our theoretical approach. If the stories of paganism really are pro-demon propaganda, why does St. Basil find so much that is useful in them? On the one hand, one might say it is because the demons behind paganism can't afford to let everything about their religion be a lie. After all, some of it would have to be attractive to ordinary people. What seems to me more likely is that since these stories are in the hands of humans, and we can see they have variation across time and space, it is the goodness of the human, as created by God, that is at work in them. St. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century makes this same argument, saying that these truths come via the prophets. Quote, "For Moses is more ancient than all the Greek writers, and whatever both philosophers and poets have said concerning the immortality of the soul, or punishments after death, or contemplation of things heavenly, or doctrines of the like kind, they have received such suggestions from the prophets as have enabled them to understand and interpret these things. And hence there seem to be seeds of truth, spermatikos logos, among all men, but they are charged with not accurately understanding the truth when they assert contradictories." End quote. Thus, not everything in a story told by a human storyteller will be altogether evil. And indeed, since humanity was made for virtue, humans will put virtue forward in their stories, sometimes because of what they pick up from better sources. In this process, then, what demons have meant for evil, God, through human agency, has turned to good. See Genesis 50:20. Baal. Here I want to spend a little time looking at some of the gods the Old Testament mentions, the pagan deities of the ancient Near East. This context should be helpful when we read the scriptures, and it will help us to recognize when the scriptures directly address these religious traditions. The most prominent among the pagan gods mentioned in the scriptures is Baal, or Baal. The word Baal by itself simply means Lord or owner, so it does not necessarily refer to a deity. Yet the Old Testament uses it this way in 90 places to refer to one of the gods of ancient paganism. He is called Baal Hadad in some ancient sources. Why do the scriptures mention him so often? He is not only the primary god the Canaanites worship, the people present in and near the land of ancient Israel, but the Israelites themselves also worship him at various times. Perhaps most famously, after the northern kingdom of Israel splits from Judah in the south, Baal worship takes over the royal family, particularly when King Ahab's wife Jezebel brings in prophets and priests of Baal, while she is persecuting those who are faithful to Yahweh. The name Jezebel itself is a theophoric, a name including the name of a god, with the ending Bel being a reference to her god Baal. Canaanite mythology depicts Baal as the son of the Most High God El, which is a Semitic word that means God. He is a thunder god, associated with fertility through the rain, but also with procreation and livestock, which is why bull imagery is connected with him. The worship of Baal included not only the usual sacrifices given to gods everywhere in the ancient Near East, but also unspeakable acts such as bestiality. In the associated mythology, Baal and his father defeat Yam, the god of the ocean, and his son Nahar, the river god, deposing them and taking their places as Most High God and ruler over the divine council, respectively. Baal also famously faces off against Mot, the Canaanite god of death, who kills him. Mot in turn gets killed by Anat, Baal's wife, and his sister, paving the way for Baal to return triumphantly from the underworld. These stories, along with other mythological stories of the Canaanite religion, appear in the Baal cycle, a series of poems in the ancient Semitic language Ugaritic, preserved on clay tablets that identify Baal with the god Hadad, thus the occasional form Baal Hadad. These tablets date from around 1300 to 1500 BC, and were lost with the destruction in 1185 BC of the city of Ugarit, located in northern Syria. They were unearthed in 1928. The most famous incident regarding Baal in the scriptures is when Yahweh defeats him through the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18. In this face-off with the prophets of Baal, Saint Elijah shows that it is Yahweh who controls the rain. First, when he stops it in the previous chapter, 1 Kings 17:1, and then by bringing it again, along with lightning from the sky. It is not only Yahweh's show of power that inspires the people to say, Yahweh is God, 1 Kings 18:39, but specifically that this power in particular is shown not to belong to Baal. No matter how much Baal's prophets call out to him to send the lightning and rain, they demonstrate only the adage from the Psalms that the gods of the nations are worthless, or Elohim, Psalm 96:5 in the New English translation. Less well known is that there are elements of Scripture that draw directly on Baal imagery to show Christ's glory and victory. For instance, Baal as storm god is called rider on the clouds in the Baal cycle, imagery that was taken over for the enthronement scene where the Son of Man comes on the clouds of heaven in Daniel 7:13 and Mark 14:62. The scriptures use this language not to say that Baal is really the Son of God, but that Baal has stolen imagery that really belongs to Christ. Further, Psalm 24 draws upon the narrative of the Baal cycle. In the myth, Baal ascends Mount Zaphon to take control of the council of the gods. As he's announcing that he will defeat Yam and Nahar, messengers from those gods arrive and warn the assembled gods not to side with Baal. In a show of humility, the gods put their heads between their knees. Baal rebukes them, saying, "Lift up your heads, O gods." Psalm 24 responds to this myth by saying that the whole world belongs to God, and he has founded it upon the seas, Yam, and established it upon the rivers, Nahar. Psalm 24:2. An image not of God doing battle with Yam and Nahar, but essentially dropping the earth on top of them. Further, the psalm asks, "Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place?" Psalm 24:3. Not the corrupt evil Baal, but rather, he who has clean hands and a pure heart, that is, the Son of God, the true ruler of the divine council. Psalm 24:4. Finally, the last verses of the psalm declare, "Lift up your heads, O gates," warning that the King of Glory is entering. Psalm 24:7-10. For many centuries, the Orthodox Church has used these words to depict Christ's invasion of the underworld, both in the 4th century Gospel of Nicodemus and also ritually at the Paschal services while the priest bangs on the door with the cross. How does this relate to Baal's story? In the cycle, Kothar Wakasis builds Baal's palace with its base in the underworld. When Christ stands at the doors of Hades and these words from the psalm are spoken, Baal is not only identified with the devil, but has his own words thrown insultingly in his face. Thus, even though the stories of the cycle were lost for over 3,000 years, the Orthodox Church preserved the understanding of what the psalm meant in terms of Christ's place as the ruler of the divine council and the victor over death. Marduk. Several other deities make significant appearances in the Old Testament, and these are all part of the spiritual neighborhood, if I may, of ancient Israel. Probably the most important of these is Marduk, the god of the city of Babylon. Like Baal, he is associated with bulls, and he is often accompanied in imagery with a dragon, a creature whom he defeated and tamed. By the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire depicted in the scriptures, Marduk is worshipped as the supreme god of the pantheon. The scriptures not only mention Marduk's name directly, but his name appears in 2 Kings 20:12 and Isaiah 39:1, which include the theophoric name of the Babylonian king Marduk Apla Idina II, which means Marduk has given a son, in the Bible, Merodach Baladan. There is also a story involving Marduk found in Daniel 14:1-22, which is only in Greek tradition Old Testaments, in a section commonly referred to as Bel and the Dragon. The story takes place during the Babylonian captivity of Israel. Bel here is simply a transliteration of Baal, but the word does not refer necessarily to the Canaanite Baal. As noted above, Baal means Lord, so this term can apply to any deity or even human masters. But it does seem that the Bel worshipped in Babylon at this time was an assimilation of Marduk, along with the Canaanite Baal, as well as the Mesopotamian gods Enlil and Dumuzid. By this point in Babylonian history, 6th century BC, the Persian king Cyrus the Great had conquered Babylon. Cyrus himself is involved in the story, worshipping Marduk, even though he is not a Babylonian. Why? In ancient paganism, although pagan kingdoms fought against each other, they generally did not say that other pagans' deities did not exist. Rather, they regarded the other gods as allies of their enemies. Cyrus thus comes to worship Marduk because he wants the god to be on his side and not to stir up the Babylonians in rebellion against him. In this story, an idol of Marduk was believed to consume large amounts of food every night. By sprinkling ashes on the floor that revealed footprints the next morning, the prophet Daniel proved that it was in fact Baal's priests who sneaked into the sealed chamber of the idol and ate sumptuously along with their families. The story shows the futility of idolatry, that the gods worshipped in the idols were not even capable of eating the food pagans offered to them. Sources outside the Bible corroborate this account. The 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus mentions a great ziggurat in Babylon, that modern historians have identified with Edamananki, an archaeological site about 60 miles south of Baghdad in Iraq. Herodotus refers to the ziggurat as dedicated to Zeus Belus, an indication that he believed the god worshipped there to be the same god as Zeus. Near the ziggurat was a place called Esagila, a temple dedicated to Marduk that included an idol of the god. Edamananki has been associated with the Tower of Babel. With the Bible's conflation of the Babel events with Babylon, remember that the names are the same in Hebrew, and the Abraham story immediately following, the overall narrative is that God calls Abraham out of a world that was dedicated to the worship of Marduk. Asherah. A few more deities are worth mentioning here. Included in the Canaanite pantheon is the goddess Asherah, who is variously the consort of El or his son Baal. The Old Testament mentions her 19 times, often in association with trees or wooden poles, which were used as part of her cult. Although Asherah is the name of a goddess, the term refers to sacred trees and poles made of wood or stone used in idolatry. So we should not understand every reference to Asherah in the Bible as about this goddess in particular. God commanded many times that these cultic objects be cut down and destroyed, as Israel syncretized idolatry into its life many times. Deuteronomy 16:21 and Judges 6:25 through 30. Solomon himself worshipped Asherah, 2 Kings 23:13 through 14. But finally, the righteous king Hezekiah opposed this idolatry, 2 Kings 18:4, though Manasseh later restored it, 2 Kings 21:2-9, and the righteous Josiah again destroyed it, 2 Kings 23:4-14. Given this background of syncretistic Asherah worship in Israel, it should be no surprise that a certain 8th century pottery fragment found in northern Sinai includes the phrase, Yahweh and his Asherah. Some scholars have spun this inscription out into a narrative in which Israel was originally polytheistic and only later shed the various gods and goddesses in favor of worshiping Yahweh alone. They also say that Yahweh originally had a wife who got edited out of the Bible, and that the biblical narrative is covering up polytheism in favor of later monotheists who found it embarrassing. This identification has a major linguistic problem, however. The instance of Asherah on that inscription is in a grammatical declension of the noun that texts never used for the goddess by that name. That means Asherah here can only refer to the ritual pole, a tree, or possibly a grove. It was, in any event, an idolatrous object. It is likely that Israel did, at points, worship Yahweh using the ritual object known as an Asherah, which is idolatrous behavior, like the worship of Yahweh via the golden calves. We should not be surprised by that, though, because the Old Testament demonstrates that Israel fell into idolatry many times. At the same time, God was telling them to stop it. The biblical text does not cover up Israel's idolatrous polytheism at all. Rather, the text exposes and condemns it, and praises rulers who opposed it. In any event, neither the biblical text nor archaeological finds show that Yahweh actually had a wife, neither Asherah nor anyone else. Other idols in and near Israel. Asherah is only one of many gods that Israel worshipped idolatrously, both during the period of rule by judges and also by the kings of both the united and divided Israel. We mentioned Baal earlier, but Solomon also built shrines for Shemesh, a Canaanite sun god, which included horses and chariots, 1 Kings 11:7 and 2 Kings 23:11. He is also called Chemosh or Kamosh. Shemesh, whose name means simply sun, was worshipped in Jerusalem before King David conquered the city, 2 Samuel 5. The fact that 3 different places in Israel were named for him attests to this worship. Beth Shemesh, which means house or temple of Shemesh, En Shemesh, and Ir Shemesh. The Moabites worshipped him, and the name Samson derives from this god. The local version of Shemesh worshipped in Jerusalem prior to David's conquest was called Shemesh Tzedakah. The epithet Tzedek shows up in the theophoric name Melchizedek, which means my king is Tzedek, which belonged to a priest-king of Jerusalem who worshipped Yahweh, Genesis 14:18 through 20, yet apparently had pagan parents who named him. The title Shemesh Tzedakah, which means son of righteousness, gets appropriated for Christ in Malachi 4:2, and it appears in numerous hymns of the Orthodox Church. Other gods that the Israel of the Old Testament worshipped include the Canaanite Astarte, also called Ashtoreth or Ishtar, and the Moabites Milcom. Solomon also introduced the worship of Molech or Moloch into Israel, 1 Kings 11:7, a particularly egregious and evil cult that burned children in sacrifice to the demon. Israel does not seem to have worshipped the Philistines' fish god Dagon or Dagon, but he figures into the Samson story when Samson destroys Dagon's temple and kills himself in the process, Judges 16:23. Dagon also appears in 1 Samuel 5, when the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant and bring it into their temple, where Dagon's idol falls down before it. Spiritual warfare. Given the presence of all this idolatry in and surrounding ancient Israel, we can understand why the scriptures mention it so often. The Bible does not describe this idolatry as merely a distraction, but rather as abomination, a betrayal of Yahweh their God, who said to them from the beginning that he is a jealous God. For this reason, St. Joshua said to the people of Israel at the renewal of the covenant at Shechem, "Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Joshua 24:14 through 15. The overarching narrative of Israel's journey in the Old Testament is about whether they will serve Yahweh or other gods. In far too many cases, it was the latter. The gods of these pagan nations are fallen angelic beings, rebels who turned away from God. Their primary sin was seeking to turn the worship of humans away from God and toward themselves. Although God had created them in love to worship and serve him, which also meant they would lead humankind to do the same, they rebelled and fell, becoming his enemies. Spiritual warfare therefore consists primarily of God making war against these demonic enemies, opposing them, and rendering judgment against them. Exodus 12:12 and Psalm 82:1 through 7. God judges the fallen gods not only to punish them, but rather to put things right. And this consists primarily of dethroning these gods and rescuing humankind from their malevolent influence, because they have been leading humanity into sin and destruction. The New Testament includes these themes of spiritual warfare as well, as the Virgin Mary prophesied that in becoming incarnate, God has brought down the mighty from their thrones, Luke 1:52. Spiritual warfare is the very reason that Christ came into this world. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil, 1 John 3:8. So how do Christians participate in this warfare? We ourselves are called to wrestle against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, Ephesians 6:12. So how do we do that? We do it precisely by doing the works of God, by being faithful, by being true sons and daughters of our Father in heaven. Sometimes people think that spiritual warfare consists of a specialized kind of prayer or discipline called exorcism. And of course, the Church has particular prayers of exorcism, especially those prayed at the beginning of a baptism, which includes passages like this, quote, "The Lord who came into the world and dwelt among men rebuketh thee, O devil, that he might bring down thy tyranny and raise up mankind. He who upon the tree did triumph over the adversarial powers when the sun was darkened, the earth was being shaken, the graves were being opened, and the bodies of the saints were arising. He who dissolved death by death, and made powerless him who exercised the dominion over death, that is thee, the devil. I adjure thee by God, who showed forth the tree of life, and who posted the cherubim and the flaming sword, turning every way to guard it. Be rebuked and depart, for I adjure thee by that one who walked upon the surface of the seas on dry land, and rebuked the stormy winds, whose glance drieth up the abysses, and whose threatening melteth the mountains. For he himself commandeth thee even now through us. Be afraid, come out, withdraw from this creature, and do not return again." End quote. These prayers are a major part of the life of the Church, but they are only part of a whole matrix of exorcistic living. Even if he or she does not consciously worship demons, every sinful thing a person does puts him or her into union with demonic forces. Likewise, whenever he or she does a work that belongs to God, not just good deeds or religious acts like prayer or fasting, but every creative act of beauty, order, love, humility, kindness, and justice, it puts him or her into union with God. Every good thing we do is a pledge or renewal of allegiance to Yahweh our God. We may therefore understand the life of Christian faithfulness as an extended exorcism, banishing away all that is evil and uniting us with all that is good. Chapter 8, Routing the Gods. And Jesus came and said to them, All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. Matthew 28:18-20. This Son of Man whom you have seen is the one who would remove the kings and the mighty ones from their comfortable seats, and the strong ones from their thrones. He shall loosen the reins of the strong, and crush the teeth of the sinners. He shall depose the kings from their thrones and kingdoms. 1 Enoch 46:4-5. We saw in chapter 5 how the nations had come to worship demonic fallen angels in the wake of the events at Babel, a relationship cemented through idolatry. Before the coming of Jesus Christ, Israel had to contend with the paganism of the ancient Near East, Canaanite, Akkadian, Sumerian, Mesopotamian, and so on. Thus, Jesus was born into the context of a world dominated by demonic oppression. His coming therefore heralded the doom of this ancient oppression. Quote, Thus all magic was dissolved, and every bond of wickedness vanished. Ignorance was abolished, and the old kingdom was destroyed, since God was becoming manifest in human form for the newness of eternal life. What had been prepared by God had its beginning. Hence, everything was shaken together, for the abolition of death was being planned. End quote. St. Ignatius of Antioch to the Ephesians. This old kingdom was precisely the kingdom of the demonic powers, characterized by ignorance, enslavement to wickedness, and magic. Christ's coming was about the abolition of death, the defeat of the last enemy, 1 Corinthians 15:26. That is why, after Jesus rose from the dead, he sent out his apostles to participate in his reclamation of the world. The authority God had given to the angelic guardians who fell into evil after Babel was given back to Christ, which is why he links that return of authority with the word therefore when he sends the apostles out. That is, because he has taken the authority back from the demons, he can now redelegate it to the apostles. They are the new patrons and guardians of the nations. A fundamental change in the order of the world happens with the coming of Christ. As his mother prophesied, God has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. Luke 1:52, meaning that Christ has deposed the demons and has exalted humans to take up this position. That said, however, even though the enemy has suffered the critical blow by Christ, demons are not yet absent from this world. The period in which we now live is a time between this decisive victory by Christ at his resurrection and the end. Christ ascended into heaven and sat on his throne next to his Father, but he now rules in the midst of his enemies. Psalm 110:2. He rules there until all his enemies are defeated and made a footstool for his feet. Psalm 110:1, Luke 20:43, Acts 2:35, Hebrews 1:13, and 10:13. Thus, when the apostles went out into the world, they continued to encounter paganism, the activity of demons among humankind. In our own time, even though ancient pagan religious traditions have been eliminated from most of the world, demons are still active among humans. Along these lines, we might think of the rise of neo-paganism. Neo-paganism is the attempt to reconstruct ancient paganism, emphasizing its gods and often including a nature-focused theme. In most cases, neo-paganism is actually quite distinct from ancient paganism, in that it doesn't typically include animal sacrifice, though in some cases it does. Even when there is animal sacrifice, however, rituals used for the purpose are new inventions, since the practice of these rituals ended many centuries ago without records detailing how they were performed. Further, Christian ethics is generally imported into neo-paganism. As one example of this ethical importation, neo-pagans generally treat women and children as full human persons who have the right of consent equal to men. Ancient paganism did not treat them that way, and Greek pagan philosophy, for instance, regarded females essentially as defective males. This viewpoint is part of why they were treated as property, often with horrifically brutal implications. Women and children as fully and equally human is a Christian concept, not a pagan one. That neo-pagans would import Christian ethics into their reconstruction of paganism shows how radical the coming of Christ was. The presence of demons among humans does not appear only in self-conscious neo-paganism, however. Any sinful activity is a cooperation with demonic powers. Even though the demons have been cast down from their thrones, like any retreating army, they are hacking and burning as they go, pillaging what they can from the humans whom God is rescuing from their occupation. Because we have not yet reached the time when all of Christ's enemies have been put at his feet, like the apostles, we still have to contend with demons and their evil. We see this contention in the New Testament, and we also see it in the history of Christianity that follows even to our own time. Thus, we will now examine how that contention has occurred, both in the New Testament scriptures and in the centuries following. I will largely limit myself in this chapter to examples from Greek and Indo-European paganism. Why? Certainly, there are many other pagan traditions in the world we could discuss, but I am focusing on Indo-European traditions, particularly Germanic, for two main reasons. First, they are what I know best. Second, and more importantly, however, these are the traditions that have most deeply influenced and informed the English language and the cultures that use it. Zeus and the New Testament. Because the events of the New Testament are largely situated within the Greek-speaking areas of the Roman Empire, The worship of the Greek gods is the most visible of the pagan traditions the New Testament mentions. A full examination of paganism in this time and place from the scriptures and history would take a large study. So we will mainly limit ourselves here to looking at one example, Zeus. Zeus is the most high god of the Greek pagan pantheon. Despite this prominence, the New Testament mentions him by name only in one place, Acts 14, where the people of Lystra identify St. Barnabas as Zeus and try to sacrifice to him. In Greek paganism, Zeus is a thunder god, the son of an incestuous marriage between the Titan siblings Kronos and Rhea. Because he had received a prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him, Kronos cannibalistically consumes his children as they are born from Rhea. But she saves Zeus through tricking Kronos by giving him a stone in the baby's place. Fulfilling the prophecy, Zeus then becomes the Most High God by launching the Titanomachy, killing his father, releasing his siblings from their father's belly, and then defeating the remaining Titans, locking them in Tartarus forever, the deepest part of the underworld. After the Titanomachy, the great multi-headed serpentine monster Typhon, a child of Gaia and the god Tartarus, challenges Zeus's control over the cosmos. With his thunderbolt, Zeus defeats the monster and sends him down into Tartarus as well. Zeus sets up his kingdom by dividing the world between himself and his brothers, Poseidon and Hades, who receive rule over the seas and underworld respectively. Zeus sets up his own throne on Mount Olympus to govern the heavens. He cements his hold on power when he successfully leads the Gigantomachy in response to an uprising against the Olympian gods by the giants, whom his grandmother Gaia had sent against him. He is famously a serial rapist and adulterer, begetting numerous demigod children with mortal women. He also had a series of marriages, most of them incestuous. His most famous divine wife is Hera, mother of Ares and Hephaestus, but she was his seventh wife and also his older sister. According to Hesiod, Zeus's first 6 wives were the nymph Metis, whom he swallows. They have a daughter, Athena, who emerges from his head. His aunt, the Titan Themis, from whom are born the seasons and fates. Another nymph named Eurynome, mother of the Graces. His sister Demeter, from whom is born Persephone. His aunt, the Titan Mnemosyne, mother of the 9 Muses. And finally, another Titan named Leto, mother of Apollo and Artemis. We can thus see that the character of Zeus is vile and immoral, even by pagan ethics, which were generally against incest, for instance. Why would Greek pagans worship such a being? Because they earnestly believed that he was the Most High God, so the worship they offered to him was essentially of the sort of the obedience offered to an earthly king in fear, and sometimes hope of receiving favors. We could examine the character of other pagan Greek gods. Hera is famously nasty and vindictive. Ares is, of course, violence personified, etc. But Zeus should suffice for our purpose, which is to give some context for Christ's appearance and the apostles' mission from him. So why is this context important? It is important because the world into which the gospel was first preached is a world that actually worshipped violent, incestuous, rapist demons. Not only did it worship these beings, but these are the stories people actually told about them, the poetry they wrote about them, the images they painted and carved. Human artists directed their highest aspirations toward these demons. The first Christians lived in a world where this worship was ever present. Thus, Christ's letter to the Christians of Pergamon in Asia Minor, as related to the Apostle John, refers to Zeus, though without naming him. I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, yet you hold fast my name. And you did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. Revelation 2:13. What is Satan's throne? In Pergamon, there was a great temple to Zeus with a massive altar dedicated to the god. Constructed in the 2nd century BC, it is roughly 117 feet or 36 meters wide and 110 feet or 33 meters deep, with its base decorated with a frieze depicting the Gigantomachy. It is U-shaped with steps 65 feet or 20 meters wide, leading up to the center between the two arms of the structure. The altars of gods are commonly referred to as thrones. So when Christ refers to Satan's throne, when he speaks to the Pergamite Christians, he is identifying Zeus with Satan. Apologetics on the Areopagus. With all this demonic evil surrounding Christians, and with an unmistakable association of the Greek pagans' most high god with the great demonic adversary of mankind, it is no wonder that St. Paul spends so much time addressing paganism in his letters to Christians who have converted from paganism and still live in pagan contexts. He not only warns them against eating the sacrifices of idolatry, 1 Corinthians 10:20 through 21, and against the sexual immorality of paganism, 1 Corinthians 6:9 through 10, but he also warns them against falling back into the old ritual patterns of pagan life, Galatians 4:8 through 11. But is utter opposition the only way the New Testament addresses paganism? Besides the abortive sacrifice in Acts 14 and the altar throne in Revelation 2, the New Testament mentions Zeus in another place, without naming him, when St. Paul quotes 2 lines from Greek poets in Acts 17:28. The context in Acts 17 is St. Paul's address to the pagans on the Areopagus, or Mars Hill, in Athens. Note the name of the place. It is named for the war god Ares. Why is it called this? Not because Ares was worshipped there, but rather because in Athenian tradition, he was put on trial there by the other gods for killing the son of Hephaestus. So when the pagan philosophers and city governing council gathered there, they would have understood themselves as participating in the judgment function of the gods, joining themselves to that pagan divine council. Why would St. Paul go to such a place? Acts 17:16 tells us, "Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him, as he saw that the city was full of idols." He thus begins preaching Jesus Christ in the local synagogue and marketplace, Acts 17:17 through 18, speaking with both Jews and other devout people, but also publicly with whomever would listen to him. Certain pagan philosophers notice this, and bring him to make his presentation on their own turf, the Areopagus, 17:19 through 21. He accepts the invitation and goes to the Areopagus. St. Paul's speech there is masterful as both a polemic against paganism and also as an apologetic for Christianity, following the pattern set in the Old Testament for both. The apostle begins by complimenting the Athenians. "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious." Acts 17:22. Isn't this the man who 6 verses earlier was provoked in his spirit regarding Athenian idolatry? It is the same man, but he is crafting his message for his audience, so that they can receive his words. He continues, "For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." Acts 17:23. No doubt the pagan Athenians did not intend to worship Yahweh with that altar to the unknown God, but were simply hedging their bets, spiritually speaking, hoping that if a God whom they did not know was angry at them, perhaps he might be placated by sacrifices offered there. Yet, St. Paul has no problem using this pagan altar to a pagan God and repurposing it for his Christian apologetic. An altar intended for some unknown demon can become a figure to point people to the God of Israel. St. Paul goes on to preach how the God whom he serves created the whole world and is not limited by temples made by humans. Acts 17:24. God also does not need anything from humanity because he is the source of all life and arranged everything so that humanity might seek him out and find him. Acts 17:25-27. He does not make it explicit here, but St. Paul is clearly contrasting God with the pagan gods, whom the pagans regard as dwelling in temples inside idols as bodies, as needing sacrifices, and as seeking after humanity to have their needs met. All these polemics against paganism are from the Old Testament, as we saw in chapter 1. As is written many times, who among the gods is like the Lord? None of them even claim to be like him. Immediately after setting up his critical frame for paganism, St. Paul quotes those lines from the Greek poets. In him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Acts 17:28. The quotations are from two different sources, but must have been well known to the Athenians, and they also reveal the educational breadth of the apostle. The first quotation, in him, etc., is likely from Epimenides of Crete, who lived in the 6th or 7th century BC, who in his Critica has King Minos say to Zeus, quote, they fashioned a tomb for you, holy and high one, Cretans always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies, but you are not dead, you live and abide forever, for in you we live and move and have our being. End quote. The second is from Aratus, about 315 to 240 BC. Quote, from Zeus let us begin. Him do immortals never leave unnamed. Full of Zeus are all the streets and all the marketplaces of men. Full is the sea and the havens thereof. Always we all have need of Zeus, for we are also his offspring. End quote. After using these two lines from pagan poetry about Zeus, St. Paul then says, being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. Acts 17:29. Thus, in this one sentence, he both appropriates language from pagan poetry and then also corrects the pagan approach by saying that God, unlike Zeus or other pagan gods, is not like any man-made image. St. Paul's final recorded words to the pagans on the Areopagus carry the call to action. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Acts 17:30-31. In one stroke, the apostle offers God's forgiveness to the pagans who have lived in the times of ignorance. But now that they know about the true God who created all things, the time has come to repent. He then leaves them with a suggestive reference to Christ, the man whom he has appointed to judge the whole world, the proof being that he rose from the dead. Why is the resurrection important here? If there is a God who raises the dead and who will righteously judge all the world, then he is clearly more powerful than any god whom the pagans worshipped, none of whom ever made such claims about themselves. From St. Paul's words on the Areopagus, therefore, we see that he is doing what we saw in the previous chapter. As St. Justin would say, quote, there seem to be seeds of truth among all men, end quote. Also, as St. Basil would say, St. Paul is making use of pagan writings after the manner of bees, carrying away what is good and leaving the rest. Why does St. Paul do this? Why not simply blast the pagans with everything they get wrong, condemning them for their wickedness, for worshiping demons, for oppressing women, children, and slaves? St. Paul is carrying out his own principle. I have become all things to all people, so that by all means I might save some. 1 Corinthians 9:22. He speaks to them with their own imagery, so that he can bring them to salvation in Christ. And because everything that is true belongs to God, there is no problem with using even pagan language to point to Christ. Even though Christianity is now beginning its ascendance over paganism, the apostle remains firmly in the tradition established in the Old Testament for how God's people ought to approach pagans. Killing the dragon. What we see in the New Testament approach to pagan religion continues the Old Testament's approach, and we can see that the Church Fathers continue this same tradition. The mission is to rescue pagans from paganism, and when pagans say something good, that is used to bring them to Christ. But when they say something bad, that is critiqued and corrected. By this means, the demons who oppress pagans through paganism are robbed of their prize, human worship. To demonstrate how this pattern continues, let's look at one of the great motifs of paganism, which I mentioned briefly when looking at the Zeus stories, divine dragon slaying. This motif continues in other forms of paganism as well, particularly in Germanic mythology and other legendary material. We can find classic examples in Norse texts and in the poem Beowulf. With both these sources, the authors of the extant texts are Christians. Beowulf is a poem about pagans written by a Christian. But why would Christians write down and preserve stories originating with Norse paganism? With a handful of exceptions, one could ask this question about nearly any form of pagan literature, which remains extant to our own day because of the work of Christians who invested great time and expense to hand copy pagan texts, usually in monasteries no less. The purpose was not, of course, to promote worshipping pagan gods. Notably, instructions for how to do so are nowhere preserved in this literature. Rather, the purpose was to go looking for St. Justin's seeds of truth everywhere, to use these texts to point toward Christ. In other words, they were continuing to do what the Old Testament prophets did, what the New Testament apostles did, and what the Church Fathers did. Christians kept these stories or composed them because they believed they could be used to serve Christ. So, with this framework in mind, given the particular example of dragon slaying, let's look at what they did. We will use the examples of the dragon Fafnir of the Volsunga saga and the Eddas, Beowulf's bane from the climax of his tale, and finally the Midgard serpent defeated by Thor. Fafnir appears in both the Eddas and also the prose Volsunga saga with essentially the same story. When we look at all three sources, we see that the essentials of the story are these. Fafnir and his brother, Regin, kill their father Hreidmar in order to get his cache of cursed gold. The dwarf and Vari had obtained the gold as weregild for their brother Otter, who had been killed by the gods Odin, Loki, and Hrungnir. After the brothers get hold of the gold, Fafnir transforms himself into a dragon and guards the gold jealously without sharing it with Regin. Regin convinces the heroic Sigurd to slay Fafnir so that they can split the gold. After Sigurd rams his sword into Fafnir from below, he and Regin have a conversation while Fafnir dies, concluding thus, quote, Fafnir said, "You will ride there and find all the gold, and it will be enough for all your days. And that gold will kill you and everyone else who owns it." Sigurd stood up and said, "I'd ride home and leave this treasure alone if I knew that I would never die. But every bold man wants to have control of his wealth until his fated death day. And you, Fafnir, lie there in your life's broken pieces, and may hell have you." And with this, Fafnir died. End quote. Sigurd exits the dragon's cave, and he and Regin proceed to cut up the dragon to eat it. Regin drinks the blood while Sigurd tastes some of the heart while it is cooking. This taste gives him the ability to understand the language of birds, and he hears birds talking with each other about how Regin is going to betray him. He thus turns and kills Regin, getting the cursed gold for himself. A Christian reading of this tale, especially in light of Genesis 3 and 4, might immediately connect the serpent in Eden with Fafnir, but also with his brother Regin, a divine being who tempts the hero. Further, both point to a treasure, one guarding, the other tempted toward, that curses the one who takes it, as the serpent points Eve to the forbidden fruit. One brother murders another, as in Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel. Finally, the result of the confrontation is that the dragon is sent to the underworld. The other great dragon of Norse myth, Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, or Midgardsormr, has the god Thor as his primary opponent, as related in the Eddas. The two best-known encounters are when Thor brings the serpent up out of the sea during a fishing expedition, and of course the final confrontation at Ragnarok. These two sources mention both encounters only very briefly, but they become iconic nonetheless. We find the fishing expedition in stanzas 21 through 24 of Hymir's poem in the Poetic Edda. Thor baits his hook with an ox head and lowers it into the water, attracting, quote, the one whom the gods hate, the all lands girdler, end quote. Thor pulls the head of the serpent up into the boat, strikes it with his hammer, then lets it sink back into the sea. The whole narrative is reminiscent of the references in the Bible to taming Leviathan, and even drawing him up with a hook, Job 41:1. A brief mention of the final battle between Thor and the Midgard serpent at Ragnarok appears in the Circe's prophecy, also called Voluspa, in the Poetic Edda, quote, then comes Hlodin's glorious boy, Odin's son, advances to fight the serpent. He strikes in wrath Midgard's protector. All men must abandon their homesteads. 9 steps Fjörgyn's child takes, exhausted from the serpent which fears no shame, end quote. The prose Edda has a fuller treatment, quote, Odin will make for Fenris Wolf, and Thor will advance at his side and be unable to aid him, because he will have his hands full fighting the Midgard serpent. Thor will be victorious over the Midgard serpent and will step away from it 9 paces. Then he will fall to the ground dead from the poison, which the serpent will spit at him. The wolf will swallow Odin. That will be the cause of his death, end quote. In this eschatological moment of the downfall of the gods, while Odin faces the wolf, who is the serpent's brother, and the wolf eats him, Thor kills the serpent, yet ultimately dies because of poison. These themes of a final divine face-off with the monstrous serpent are similar to those in Christian sources, but Thor dies while killing his foe and has no hope of return. Christ's defeat of the eschatological dragon, however, does include his own death, but sees him coming back to life and destroying the death demon forever. The final dragon we will mention here is the unnamed serpent, often called Beowulf's Bane, whose destruction by the hero is roughly the last third of the Old English poem Beowulf, lines 2200 through 3182. This dragon has many of the features we see with both biblical and Norse mythological dragons. It lives underground in a barrow, which associates it with the underworld. It guards a cursed treasure. It breathes fire like Leviathan and is a threat to the whole kingdom. Beowulf confronts the dragon alone and kills it, but, like Thor, he ultimately dies in the process. Yet while there is no resurrection for Beowulf in the poem, the end suggests some kind of spiritual future for him, in that it details his funeral and how he will be remembered. In these tales, we see a continuity with dragons found in explicitly Christian sources after the New Testament. I discussed St. Basil's text on pagan literature in the last chapter, and he actually mentions dragons in a passing reference. Quote, "For of what use now are riches, if one scorns the pleasures of the flesh? I certainly see none, unless, as in the case of the mythological dragons, there is some satisfaction in guarding hidden treasure." End quote. Here we see that St. Basil is not only aware of the traditions of dragons guarding hidden treasure, but he associates dragons with the bald pleasure of desiring and possessing treasure. This image connects back to Genesis 3, in which the serpent is not so much guarding a treasure as tempting toward it, offering the object of desire as an end in itself, rather than referring it to a higher purpose. In another Christian source, the 7th century Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, an extra-canonical and highly fanciful infancy Gospel of Jesus, we read a tale of the young Jesus fleeing to Egypt with his mother Mary, foster father Joseph, and Joseph's children, a reference to the canonical Matthew 2:13 through 15. In chapter 18, the family stops to rest in a cave, and dragons issue forth from it, frightening the other children. The 2-year-old Jesus climbs down from his mother and confronts the dragons. They bow before him and become tame. And the text says that this is a fulfillment of Psalm 148:7. "Praise the Lord from the earth, ye dragons, and all you deeps." Finally, the 4th and 5th century bishop and homilist St. John Chrysostom, in his homily 24 on 1 Corinthians, describes what happens when Christ entered into Hades through his death on the cross. Quote, "And that which happened to the Babylonian dragon, when, having taken the food, it burst asunder in the midst, this also happened unto him. For Christ came not forth again by the mouth of death, but having burst asunder and ripped up in the very midst the belly of the dragon, thus from his secret chambers right gloriously he issued forth, and flung abroad his beams, not to this heaven alone, but to the very throne most high. For even there did he carry it up." End quote. In Chrysostom's depiction, Christ enters into the mouth of the devouring dragon of death, and as it is feeling nauseated and wants to vomit, Christ rips it into pieces from the inside, not only escaping death, but destroying its power forever. He uses similar imagery in his famed Paschal homily. Jesus here not only defeats the dragon, but also brings out the treasure hidden within. He raises up the dead saints. Quote, "For when Christ's body was crucified, then were the dead raised up. Then was that prison burst, and the gates of brass were broken, and the dead were loosed, and the keepers of Hellgate all cowered in fear." End quote. Christ looting the treasures held in Hades by the dragon is a theme found throughout Christian tradition, and perhaps most memorably in the Gospel of Nicodemus, which focuses especially on the harrowing of Hades. Christian tradition also associates dragon slaying with both the Archangel Michael, due to the reference in Revelation 12:7, and St. George, whose hagiography famously includes Dracomachy. Sometimes he kills the dragon, and sometimes he tames it. Integration of the pagan into Christianity. To wrap up this chapter, I want to look briefly at a few examples of Christian culture that fully integrate pagan imagery into Christian objects. Here we see not only allusions to pagan literature or the use of pagan titles and terminology, but clearly pagan images referring to pagan stories, yet turned to the use of Christians to point to Jesus Christ. I told the story earlier of the slaying of Fafnir by Sigurd. This story appears on carved wooden doorposts that adorned the outside of the Hillestad Stave Church, a 12th or 13th century church in Norway. The church itself no longer exists, but after it was demolished in the 17th century, the carvings were reused in other buildings, and are now on display at the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. Why would Norwegian Christians put these images on their church? I once had someone suggest to me that it was to lure in pagans who would see Sigurd on the outside of the building, then presumably enter and stay, even though the inside of the building was clearly Christian. This makes no sense, however, as the church was built centuries after the last Norse pagan was baptized into Christianity. There would have been no pagans around to be lured in by this facile religious bait and switch. While you think about that question, consider another object, the Frank's casket. This is a small box on display at the British Museum in London, likely made in the early 8th century in Northumbria, northern England. All indications are that it was monastic in origin. Its size and shape suggest that it might have been used as a reliquary. What is on this box? Some of the carved illustrations are hard to decipher, but the parts that have been successfully identified include a depiction of Romulus and Remus, the founders of pagan Rome, the capture of Jerusalem by Titus, Roman general and later emperor, Wayland the Smith, a semi-divine Germanic legendary figure also known as Voland or Veland, and the adoration of Christ by the Magi. Here we have generally pagan images and one clearly Christian one. Again, what is going on here? The Christians who made these objects included pagan imagery on them, not to glorify the pagan gods or to encourage their worship. Indeed, as I have looked into this pre-modern phenomenon, I have not yet found images of actual gods. The closest one gets is ambiguous figures like Wayland. It seems to me that the adoration of the Magi summarizes the purpose beautifully in a story from Matthew 2, 1 through 12. In this story, men from the East, who are variously described as magicians, astrologers, wise men, or kings, who are certainly pagans, came to worship Jesus Christ, led by a miraculous star they saw and followed. It is an image of pagans who follow what they know and then encounter Christ, repenting and giving him their worship. For the same reason, the author of Beowulf can refer to God as Ulf-Walda, which means elf ruler, in line 1314 of this Old English poem. As a Christian who knew the Germanic pagan tradition well, he inherited the concept of elves from his cultural past. In this tradition, an elf is a spirit, an immaterial being who is part of the unseen population of the Germanic world. For the poet, therefore, the Walda, which means lord or ruler, who is above them all, is properly the Ulf-Walda. Or to put it another way, he is the Lord of spirits. Chapter 9. The Sons of God. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. Romans 8, 18 through 19. According to nature, then, that is, according to creation, so to speak, we are all sons of God, because we have all been created by God. But with respect to obedience and doctrine, we are not all the sons of God. Those only are so who believe in him and do his will. And those who do not believe and do not obey his will are sons and angels of the devil, because they do the works of the devil. Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. Christians are called to be saints. It is the very purpose of Christian life. What does that mean, though? To understand the possibility of sanctity, it might help to consider its opposite. What is the opposite of a saint? It's not a question we consider very often. Typically, we juxtapose sinners with saints. Since we know we're all sinners, which therefore seems ordinary, saints are people who are better than the rest of us. So we divide the spiritual world of humans into the ordinary and the special. But what is the opposite of an angel? This seems easier. The opposite of angels are demons. They are fallen angels, and the holiness and glory of angels is juxtaposed with the evil and darkness of the demons. Here we do not see a division between ordinary and special, but rather between glorious and diabolical. So what if I told you it's possible for humans also to be dark and diabolical, to become like demons in their evil rebellion against God? It is a frightening thought, but it accords with our experience, at least with our experience as a human race in history. Some people have become so evil, so cruel, so self-indulgent, that the scale of their sin has slaughtered millions. Why focus on this? My purpose here is not to spend time contemplating evil, so that we might be fascinated at how deep into a human heart it truly can go. Rather, it is so that we might understand better what it really means to be a saint. So what is actually the opposite of a saint? In the Bible, it's a giant, the Nephilim. If there is a biblical story that above all others stirs up excitement, spawns conspiracy theories, inspires spiritual thrillers, and can dominate late-night alternative radio shows, it is the story in Genesis 6 about the rise of the giants. People get excited when you talk about giants, especially when you take them seriously.